Hey Calvary kids, I'm glad that you've joined us again for Sunday, and it's been a while since we've gone back to the Old Testament, because remember we took a couple weeks off to talk about Easter, which is in the New Testament. So now we're going to go back to the Old Testament, and so I think it'd be helpful to review a little bit where we were, since it's been a while. So if you remember, where we left off is God's people had been in exile, but God gave Cyrus, the guy in charge, the idea of sending God's people back home. And remember, he not only sends them home, but he also sends them home with lots of gifts and gold and silver. So God really had provided for his people in big ways. And if you remember, some of the leaders of this first group were Zerubbabel and Joshua. But also, this isn't the Joshua that led the people into the promised land. He's been dead quite a while. This is a different guy named Joshua. So Zerubbabel and Joshua are the guys in charge. And remember, one of the first things the people do is they rebuild the altar so that they can offer sacrifices to God, and they lay the foundation of the temple. Now, if you don't recall what a foundation is, that's like the big slab of stone buildings are built on top of. So it's like the first extra important step of building a building. So they laid the foundation of the temple. And if you remember, some people were really happy about that because they're just excited to have a temple again. But some people were kind of upset because it didn't seem like this temple was going to be as great as the temple that had been there before it was destroyed by the Babylonians. So that's kind of where we left off. So pause for a moment, and as a family, find Ezra 4, because that's where our story is going to pick up this week. So pause as a family and find Ezra 4. So, if you remember, God's people had laid the foundation of their temple, right? But shortly after that, they actually stopped working on it. And part of this is because the people that lived around them were not super excited about God's people rebuilding the temple. So they faced a little bit of opposition. They didn't really always get along with the people around them. And so, I have a question for you I want you to discuss as a family. And that question is following God always easy? And along with that, just because something is hard, does that mean we shouldn't do it if God asks us to? So pause a moment as a family and discuss, first of all, is following God always easy? And along with that, just because something is hard that God asks us to do, does that mean that we shouldn't do it? So, as I'm sure you all talked about, following God isn't always easy. Sometimes God asks us to do really difficult things. You don't have to look too many places in the Bible to realize that God often asks his people to do hard things. So, just because it was hard to rebuild the temple doesn't mean that they shouldn't be doing that. So, God actually sends two prophets to help encourage the people to keep on working on their temple. And these two prophets are named Haggai and Zechariah. And they actually both wrote books of the Bible that records their messages of encouragement. So if you want, maybe later this week, it'd be good to go through them as a family maybe and see what we can learn from those. But we're going to stick with staying in Ezra for the time being. Now, at this time, there's two leaders of Persia. There's King Darius, and then there is also a guy named Tatnai. And he was the governor of the area Jerusalem was in. So it's kind of like King Darius is kind of like the president of the United States, and Tatnai is kind of like the governor of Indiana. So there's the guy that's in charge of everything, and then there's a bunch of guys in charge of smaller areas. Now, Tatnai sees the people working on the temple, and he decides to do something. And so as a family, I want to see if you guys can find what he decided to do. And so the place to look for that is Ezra 5, 3 through 5. So pause as a family and see if you can figure out what Tatnai decided to do when he saw the people start to rebuild the temple. So we see that Tatnai sees the people working on the temple, and he isn't really sure that they actually have permission to do that they're not actually allowed to do that. So what he ends up doing is he actually sends a letter to King Darius saying, hey, they're starting to do this. I don't know if it's really allowed. Do I stop them? What do I do? And so King Darius receives this and orders some of his men to go search back in the historical records. People wrote down everything that had happened to see if they really had permission to rebuild the temple. And it's found. The royal order, King Cyrus's order that they could go back home and rebuild the temple, is found. And so King Darius not only tells Tatnai not to bother them, he also tells Tatnai to give them whatever they need to rebuild the temple. So once again, God provides for his people by not only allowing them to rebuild the temple, but by making a way for them to receive any type of building material they needed, any type of money they needed in order to get this temple built. And then we see the temple is finished, and the people are super excited to once again have a place where they can go to worship and meet with God. But I want you all to see what other things the people might have done after the temple is completed. They do a few different things, so I want to see if you can find out what those are. And for that, check Ezra 6, 16 through 22 to find out what did the people do after the temple was finished. So we see the people offer sacrifices of praise to God, and we see them celebrate Passover, which is a super important holiday for the Jewish people, where they celebrate them leaving Egypt as a freed people because of what God had done for them while they were in Egypt. We learned a little bit about that last week because Passover is the same holiday that Jesus and his disciples were celebrating together shortly before Jesus was killed and raised from the dead. So once again, we come to our question, what does this have to do with us? Right? Kind of a weird story, and honestly, this is a part of the Bible that, I've read, but I'm not super familiar with it as I am other parts of the Bible. So what does this have to do with us? Well, we see the temple was essential to the Jewish people, to God's people. They needed it because they needed to offer sacrifices for their sin, and in fact, they couldn't even do that themselves. They needed the priests to offer the sacrifices for them, to go to God for them. They couldn't do it themselves. But here's my question. Why is it that we no longer need a temple? Why do we not need a temple? Why do we not still offer sacrifices for our sin? What has changed? So discuss that as a family, see what you come up with. So we see that we no longer need a temple. We don't need to offer sacrifices for our sin anymore because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. And because of what Jesus did for us on the cross, we no longer need priests to go to God for us. We can go directly to God for him to hear us and for him to forgive us of our sins. We don't need a priest to do that for us. Since our relationship with God is fixed through the work of Jesus, we can go to him on our own. So we don't need a temple or an altar for sacrifices anymore because Jesus has enabled us to go to God ourselves. But then that leads to another question. Well, if we don't really need a temple and we can just go to God ourselves, why do we need church? Why do we need to come to church? So pause us a minute as a family and talk about why is it that we need to come to church? So we see that even though we can now go to God ourselves, it's super important to be surrounded by a community of people that are also trying to follow Jesus. And it is kind of a little weird right now because we're not actually meeting in person, right? We're having our services online. You're probably watching this at home with your family. But what's cool is that the church isn't just a building. The church is actually the people, the community who is following after God. So even though we're not meeting in person, we're still learning about God. We're still following God together and living on mission for God together. And that's what the church does. And so someday we're going to be able to meet together again, and it's going to be awesome and joyous. And the reason we do that is to encourage one another, to build one another up. So even though we can't do that in person right now, we look forward to a time where we can build each other up and meet together in person. And that kind of relates to my challenge for you all this week, is that even though we can't meet in person, it's still important to have that community as a church family. So my challenge for you is we're privileged to have technology that we can still talk with people and see people without actually being in the same room as them. So my challenge for you is to creatively hang out with a friend this week, whether that's a video chat, whether that's a phone call. Maybe you have your parents help to have them type out a text to a friend's parent for you. Maybe you figure out how to play a game like tic-tac-toe or something over video chat. So that's my challenge for you all this week, is find a way to reach out to someone in your church family to hang out and build community as we celebrate as one body, one church of God. So until next time, Calvary kids, see you later.